She married a cursed blacksmith to escape her uncle. He held the deed to every silver mine. The first thing I noticed about her wasn't her face. It was her hands. The way she held them flat on the counter of Dupree's dry goods, palms down, fingers spread wide, like she was pinning something to the wood that might fly away. Her knuckles were white. She wasn't looking at Dupree or at anything in the store. She was watching the door behind her in the reflection of the window glass, watching for something that hadn't come through it yet but was going to. I set down the iron stock I'd come for and waited. When a person is that coiled, you don't walk into them sideways. She bought a tin of crackers and a half-pound of salt and paid, without saying how much it cost or asking. Dupree didn't correct her. I watched him pocket the difference, 6 cents, without blinking. She walked out, and I thought that was the end of it, whatever it was, and I picked up my iron and went back to the forge. Her name was Cora Vane. I found that out 3 days later when her uncle, Franklin Vane, came to my shop and told me she'd gone missing from his house on the ridge and had anyone seen a woman, dark hair, around 26, wearing a gray dress. I said no, because I had seen a brown dress, not gray, and I didn't feel like helping Franklin Vane find anything he was looking for. He knew that, stood in the door of my shop with his hat in his hand, and that look he had, like he was always weighing what a man would cost him to ruin against what it would cost him to leave alone. He'd done his math on me a long time ago and decided ruination was cheap. So he nodded, like I'd confirmed something, and left. That was a Wednesday. She came to my shop on Friday before dawn, knocked 3 times low on the back door, and when I opened it she said, "I need to speak with you. I know who you are. I know what they say about you. I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes and I'll leave if you say no." I let her in, put the kettle on, and she talked. What she said was this. Her father, Gideon Vane, had filed on 12 silver claims in the Caldera Basin 8 years before he died. Not small claims, long vein claims, properly surveyed and recorded at the territorial office in Bixar. He'd spent 4 years doing it right, which was not the way most men did it out here. He had the deeds, carbon copies and an original, and he'd kept them in a tin box in the floor of the house he built on the ridge. When Gideon died, the house and everything in it passed to his brother Franklin under a will that Franklin produced 10 days after the funeral. Cora had been 18. There was no one to contest it on her behalf. But her father had anticipated something like this. 6 months before he died, she didn't know if he was sick, if he knew, or if he was just a careful man. Gideon Vane had visited a blacksmith in a town called Myrna, 3 days' ride east. He'd commissioned a piece of work, a deed box of my making, iron and steel, double-locked, with a false bottom. He'd told the blacksmith what to put in it, and the blacksmith had put it there, and Gideon had paid him and ridden home. That blacksmith was me. I'm not going to pretend I remembered the box right away. I've made 100 boxes, but when she described the latchwork, a spring release behind the left hinge, you had to push it in and up simultaneously with a specific tension, not just pressure, I remembered. It was an unusual mechanism. I'd been proud of it. She said the original deeds were in the false bottom. That Franklin had found the box, opened the main compartment, and thought that was the whole of it. That he'd been working the claims under his own name for 6 years while she lived in his house and said nothing, because she was waiting. Waiting for what? I said. For a way out that didn't end with him finding me first. I looked at her across the work table. The fire in the forge was banked low, just coals, and the light it gave was red and not very much. She had a bruise at the line of her jaw, faded to yellow but still wide. She was watching me the same way she'd watched the door in Dupree's, steady, taking in information, not expecting rescue. I said, "Why me?" She said, "Because you made it. Because if anyone could open it without the key, it's you. And because you have no reason to help Franklin Vane and every reason not to." That was true enough. She also said, and this part she said flatly, with no expression to it, that she'd heard what the town said about me. The curse. 3 men who'd partnered with me on ventures had come to bad ends. 1 thrown from a horse, 1 dead of fever, 1 caught cheating cards and shot before he cleared his chair. She said she didn't believe in curses. She said she was more afraid of Franklin Vane than of anything a dead man's bad luck could do to her. I told her she might be making a poor trade. She said she'd made worse ones. The story of the curse is shorter and stupider than people make it. Holt Draper wanted my shop. He made me 3 offers over 2 years, each one lower than the last, because that's how Holt Draper operated. He'd offer fair, then less, then insult you, and somewhere in the insulting you get tired and fold. When I didn't fold, he started talking. Said the forge fire had something wrong in it. Said I'd shot a horse that threw a man, and it was the shoes. Said the fever that took Kelly's ambruster spread from something I'd sold him. None of it was true. Draper was just better at talking than I was at defending myself, and I'd never been much good at either one. That was 7 years ago. I was 34. By the time I turned 40, I'd stopped trying to unsay it. A man gets tired of fighting air. So I was the cursed blacksmith of Myrna, and my shop was half empty of business, and I had a reputation that kept most sensible people at a distance, and that was my life. I didn't hate it. I had my work. I slept fine. I told myself that was enough. I hadn't told myself that in a while, actually. Maybe a year, maybe longer, but I wasn't examining it very closely. Cora Vane sat in my shop in the coal-red dark and didn't flinch when a log cracked in the forge, and I thought about what she'd said. That she'd heard what they called me. That she was more afraid of Franklin Vane than of bad luck. I said, if I help you get those deeds, what then? You go to Bixar alone. She said, I've thought about this. If I go alone, he'll intercept me before I'm an hour out of town. He has 2 men who watch the road. I need to go with someone he won't think to stop. He'll think to stop me. He doesn't like me much. No, but there are things he won't do in front of witnesses, and Myrna will see us leave together. And there are things he won't do at all if he thinks it will cost him more than it gains him. I said, what does that mean exactly, leaving together? She looked at me straight. I mean, if I were your wife. I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who ever thought much about marriage, not because I was against it, but because it had never seemed like a real thing that would happen to me. The curse was part of it, sure, the way it kept people sideways and at arm's length. But even before that, before Draper started his mouth going, I've been the kind of man who was easy to overlook. Not ugly, not dim. Just not the kind of man a woman's eye rests on when there are easier options nearby. I'm telling you this because what Cora Vane proposed was practical. She said so. She said it clearly. She was not saying she had feelings for a man she'd spoken to once across a forge in the dark. She was saying that a married woman was harder to chase down and drag home than a runaway niece, and that a husband with a legitimate interest in her safety had standing to file with the marshal in a way that she alone did not. She was thinking about it the way you think about crossing a river. What's the best way over? I said I needed to think about it. She said she had to be back before he noticed she was gone. She'd come through the dry wash behind the ridge, 2 miles in the dark. I said, come back tomorrow night. She came back, and I said yes. We married 4 days later at the chapel on Cottonwood Road, which was the fastest the preacher would perform it. I paid his fee. Cora had nothing. She came to the ceremony with what she was wearing, and a canvas bag with a change of clothes and a book. I didn't ask about the book. Franklin Vane found out by noon the day after. I know because he came to my shop with a different expression than usual, not the weighing calculation look, but something behind the eyes that was purely cold. He stood in my doorway for a long time without speaking. I set down my hammer and waited. He said, "You've done something foolish." I said, "I've done a lot of those, can't seem to stop." He said, "She has nothing, whatever she told you." She told me she needed a husband, I said. I needed a wife, seemed straightforward. His jaw worked. He was running the math again, I could see it. What I was worth to fight, what I might know or do. Whether she'd told me about the claims. He didn't know what she'd told me, and that uncertainty was the only thing keeping his voice level. He said, I hope it works out for you both, in a tone that meant the opposite of that, and he left. Cora was at the house. I'd given her the back room and I slept in the room off the shop, the way I always had. She'd cleaned the kitchen in the 2 days since the wedding thoroughly, in a way that suggested she'd needed something to do with her hands. The shelves were straight, the floor swept. There was a smell of pine soap that hadn't been there before. I told her about Vane's visit. She listened without interrupting. I said, he's going to move on the mine soon. If he suspects you know about the deeds, he'll either disappear the box or relocate it. She said, how long do we have? I said, a week, maybe 10 days. She said, all right, and went back to the shelf she was straightening, and I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a second, that same flat steadiness she'd had from the beginning, and thought that whatever this was, she was the least fragile thing in it. Getting into Franklin Vane's house on the ridge was not, ultimately, very difficult. What was difficult was the 2 weeks before it, which were the 2 weeks of us learning to occupy the same space without stepping on each other. She rose earlier than me, and I rose before light, and by the time I was at the forge she'd had coffee on and drunk half of it and was reading or mending something in the chair by the window. She didn't talk in the morning. Neither did I. We figured that out by the 3rd day without discussing it. She ate whatever I had. I didn't have much, being a man who'd cooked for himself for 15 years and had strong opinions only about coffee. She cooked better than I did. A lot better. She didn't say so. She just quietly started making the meals and I quietly let her. She asked me once, in the 2nd week, about the curse. Not in a picking at it way. We were sitting on the back step after supper, the light going orange behind the hills, and she said, tell me about Holt Draper. So I told her the 3 offers, the dropped price, the talking, the way it had stuck. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which was a thing I'd noticed she did, let a person finish entirely before she spoke. Then she said, so he wanted what you had and couldn't get it, so he took it a different way. I said, that's about the size of it. She said, that's not a curse, that's just a man being mean. I didn't say anything. She said, you know that. I said I knew it. She said, but you let it sit. And that, I don't know why that particular thing, said in that particular tone, not accusing, just observing, sat in my chest the rest of the evening and kept sitting there for days after. Because she was right. And because no one had ever said it to me exactly like that, like it was a simple fact about me that could also be changed. Like I had a choice about it that I'd just been slow to take. We went up to the ridge on a Tuesday night, 3rd week of October. I knew the layout of Vane's house from a job I'd done there 5 years before, new hinges on the barn, a lock for the cellar door. I knew the cellar door's lock because I'd made it, and I still had the pattern of the key in my mind, the way a man remembers the shape of a hand he shook once, specific and exact. I'd made a working copy in the days before we went. Cora came with me. I'd said she didn't have to, and she'd looked at me like I'd said something childish. So she came. We went up the back way, through the same dry wash she'd used to come to my shop. It took 40 minutes. The house was dark and his 2 men were at the bunkhouse, lights on, which meant cards. We had time, but not much. The cellar lock opened on the 2nd try. We went down into the dark, lamp shuttered to a thin strip of light, and I found the workbench where I'd last seen the box, and it was there. Bigger than I'd remembered, or maybe I just remembered the mechanism more than the size. I crouched down with it and Cora held the lamp steady and I found the hinge, the left one, and pressed the spring the way I designed it, in and up, a specific tension, not just push. It caught. There was a click that was different from the main lock's click, quieter, and the false bottom released. Inside was a folded oilskin wrapped twice over. I didn't open it there. I put it inside my coat and we left. Coming down the dry wash in the dark, she caught my arm once when I slipped on loose shale. Just grabbed my elbow, steadied me, let go. We didn't speak until we were back on the flat and the lights of town were visible ahead. She said, "Did it hold up?" "The oilskin." I said, "We'll know when we open it." She said, "It's been 6 years." I said, "Your father wrapped it twice. He was being careful." She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "He was always careful. It used to make me impatient." A pause. "I miss it now." We walked the rest of the way back in the dark without talking, but she didn't let go of my arm. The deeds were intact. We spread them on my work table in the shop, and she went through them one by one, her lips moving slightly over the language, the legal language, the survey language, all the careful specific words her father had paid to have exactly right. 12 claims, 12 sets of coordinates, 12 signatures from the Big Sur territorial office, each with a stamp and a date. She didn't cry. I'd half expected it. She sat with the last one in her hands for a long time, her head down, and I put water on for coffee and didn't say anything. When she looked up, her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she looked like she'd come to the end of a very long road and was resting before the next one. She said, "We ride for Big Sur in the morning." I said, "Yes." She said, "He'll know by morning, possibly sooner." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry, I know this will cost you. He'll make trouble for the shop." I said, "He already made trouble for the shop." She looked at me then, just a look, quiet across the table, and I don't know how to describe it except to say it had weight, like she was placing something. She said, "Will you go back, after Big Sur? Will you come back here?" And I realized, sitting there at 2 in the morning with a lamp between us and 12 stolen deeds on my work table, that I hadn't thought past Big Sur. That I'd been thinking about this thing in segments, getting to Big Sur as the end of it, and I hadn't asked myself what came after. I said, "I've got a shop here." She said, "I know, I'm asking." I said, "Yes, I'll come back." She nodded once, like that confirmed the same thing it would have done had she nodded in Dupree's with her palms flat on the counter. Then she said, "Good," and picked up the deeds and started refolding them. We rode out at first light. Franklin Vane's 2 men were on the south road by 8, but by 8 we were already an hour east on the Big Sur trace which goes north before it curves. Cora knew the trace and I trusted her. We rode hard until noon, then walked the horses, then rode again. We didn't speak much. The land out here is high grass and broken butte, cold in October, the sky big and gray, and there was something about the silence of it that didn't feel like empty silence. It felt like the silence of 2 people who don't need to fill the space between them. We camped the first night in a dry creek, fire small, and she made coffee on it that was better than anything I made in a kitchen with proper equipment. I don't know what she did differently. I watched her do it and I still couldn't tell. She said once before she slept, "He'll contest it, Franklin. He'll say the will covers all of it." I said, "The deeds predate the will, and they're in Gideon's name, not the estate's. The territorial office recorded them separately. Your name is on the transfer paper your father filed." She was quiet. I said, "I looked at the language. I'm not a lawyer, but it looks like he was thorough." She said he was. She went asleep not long after that. I sat up for a while and fed the fire and listened to the horses and thought about nothing much, which is something I'm good at and not ashamed of. We reached Big Sur on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The territorial office was a long, low building on the main street, government-built, solid but plain. Cora went in first and I followed. She didn't hesitate at the door, didn't slow, went straight to the clerk's window with the deeds in the oilskin under her arm, and I watched her set the package on the counter and explain it in a voice that was clear and flat, and gave no room for the clerk to interrupt. The clerk interrupted anyway. She answered him. He tried again. She produced the deeds and laid them out and pointed, specifically and without hurry, to each signature and each date, and at a certain point the clerk stopped interrupting and started taking notes. I stood back. I am not a man who needs to be in the middle of things to feel like they're going right. I watched her work and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfied isn't quite the word. It's more like ease. Like something clicking into place that had been sitting just wrong for years. It took 2 hours. At the end of it, the clerk stamped a document, made a copy, put the original deeds in a file box, and told her she'd receive written confirmation within 30 days. He said there might be a dispute process if another party filed a challenge. She said she expected that and was prepared for it. He said good day. We walked out into the afternoon light. The street was busy and noisy and smelled like horse and mud and smoke from somewhere, and she stopped on the boardwalk and stood still for a second, just breathing, and I stopped beside her. She said, "That's it." I said, "That's it." She turned and looked at me. Not the careful measuring look she'd had in the forge that first night, or the flat assessing look she used on people who were in her way. This was something else, plainer, like she was letting herself look without the guard on it. She said, "Thank you." I said there wasn't much to thank, she'd done the work. She said, "You know what I mean." I did. I said, "Yeah." She put her hand on my arm, the same way she'd caught me on the shale coming down from the ridge, and left it there. That was all. But in the middle of that big Sar street in the cold afternoon with the noise of the town around us, it was not a small thing. She left her hand there and I put mine over it briefly, and that was what it was. We rode back on the same trace. There was more talking on the way back. I don't remember all of it. She asked about the shop, what I made mostly, whether I had work I liked and work I didn't. I told her the ironwork I liked best was mechanisms, locks, hinges, things with moving parts that had to do something specific and couldn't fake it. That a mechanism either worked or it didn't, and that was clarifying. She said that made sense for me. I asked what she meant. She said, "You like things that are what they are. You don't make them be anything else." I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "What do you like?" She said, "Order, knowing where things belong. I like it when a thing is where it's supposed to be." I said, "Your uncle's house must have been hard." She said, "Very." She talked a little about her father. Not much. She rationed it, took it out carefully, one thing at a time. He had been a methodical man, patient. He had taught her to read deeds when she was 12, sitting at the same table I'd laid the deeds out on, showing her what the language meant. She said he had a way of teaching that didn't talk down and didn't rush, just laid things out and let you see them. I said he sounded like someone worth knowing. She said he would have liked you. I didn't know what to do with that. I said something small about it and let it sit, but it stayed. We came back into Myrna on a Saturday morning, 8 days after we'd left. The town knew we'd gone. The town had noted what it always noted, the blacksmith with the bad luck, and now this woman who'd run from her uncle. What a pair they made. What would come of it? I'd long since stopped paying attention to what Myrna thought, but I was aware of the looks as we rode the main street. I didn't find them as easy to ignore as I usually did, and I wasn't sure if that was because of her or because something in me had shifted in the 8 days, and I was seeing things a little differently. She was seeing them too. I could tell. She sat her horse straight and didn't look away from anything. Franklin Vane was at my shop. He was standing in front of it with 2 men and his hat pulled down, and when he saw us come up the street I watched him do the calculation one more time. We were back. She'd gone and come back with her husband. He didn't know yet what we'd done in Bixar. He was going to figure it out, but he didn't know yet. I stopped my horse short of the shop, and Cora stopped beside me. Vane said, "I'd like to speak with my niece." I said, "She's my wife." He said, I know what she is. I said, then you know she can speak for herself. If she wants to talk to you, she'll say so. He looked at her, she looked at him. She said, I don't have anything to say to you right now, Uncle Franklin. That word, the tone she put on it, like she was picking it up with 2 fingers and putting it down somewhere distant. He stood there for a moment longer and then he turned and left. His men followed. The contested filing came through from Bixar 5 weeks later, as expected. Franklin Vane hired a lawyer from Laramie and filed a dispute on the basis of the estate will. Cora hired the only lawyer in Myrna, a man named Arliss Peck who was decent but not brilliant, and I went to Bixar myself and spent 3 days in the Territorial Records room going through Gideon Vane's filings one by one, because no one knew the paper trail like the man who'd made the box that held it. I am not a lawyer and don't plan to become one, but I can read a document. And what I found in those 3 days was that Gideon Vane had been more careful than careful. He'd filed not just the deeds but a separate testamentary document, witnessed and stamped, that specified the claims as belonging to his daughter, outside the estate, not subject to the will's disposition. It had been filed 6 months before he died, around the same time he'd come to my shop in Myrna. He'd known. I brought Arliss Peck what I'd found. Arliss Peck took it to the hearing in Bixar. The hearing lasted a day and a half. Franklin Vane's lawyer from Laramie did his job, and Arliss Peck did his job better, and at the end of it the territorial judge ruled in Cora's favor on all 12 claims. She was in the courtroom when the ruling came down. I was in the back. I watched the back of her head, her shoulders, when the judge said the words. She didn't move. Not a flinch, not a release. She just sat there for a moment longer and then she nodded once to herself and put her hands flat on her knees. On the way out she found me in the crowd, and when she saw me she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She put both arms around me, right there in the courthouse corridor, and held on. Not briefly. Long enough for me to put my arms around her, which I did, and for the noise of the corridor to keep going around us while we stood still in it. She said against my shoulder, "He put it there for me." I said, "I know." She said, 6 months before he died, he came to you. He had you build the box. He filed the separate document, he knew. I said, he did everything he could. She held on a little longer. I didn't move. Then she stepped back and her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. The way a person can be both of those things at once, and she said, "Let's go home." I want to tell you about the evening she said that thing. Not the courthouse. I mean a different evening, the one that's been sitting in me for years. It was maybe a month after the ruling. The claims were secured. She'd hired a surveyor to go out and assess the current state of the operations, to figure out what had been taken and what was recoverable. Franklin Vane had left Myrna. His 2 men had left before him. The shop had gotten 3 new customers in the weeks since the ruling, men who'd known about Draper's talk for years and had held off, and who'd decided, apparently, that the curse was either lifted or had never been real. I wasn't going to argue with the business. Cora had moved her things into the main room, not the shop, my workroom, the living quarters. We'd gotten to that gradually and without much ceremony, the way 2 people find where they belong in a space over time. It happened and we let it. It was November. Cold. She'd made a fire in the back room after supper and we were both in it, her with her book and me with a piece of mechanism I was fitting, a small trigger assembly someone wanted done, fiddly work. The fire was good. The room smelled like wood smoke and the pine soap she still used. At some point she set the book down and looked at me, not the careful look, the plain one, the one I'd first seen in Bixar on the boardwalk. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." I said, "All right." She said, "Did you say yes to the marriage because you pitied me, or because you wanted something from the claims, or because of some other calculation? I won't be angry. I just want to know what it was." I looked up from the mechanism. She was watching me directly. Steady. This was what she did, I'd learned. She asked the uncomfortable things straight, no preamble, and waited for you to be honest with her. I said no to all of those. She said, then why? I said, because you walked into my shop in the dark and told me what they called me, and said you were more afraid of your uncle than of my bad luck. And I thought that was the most plain-spoken thing anyone had said to me in years, maybe longer. She didn't look away. I said, and you sat across that table and didn't flinch, and I thought. I stopped, put the mechanism down. I thought if a woman like that thought I was worth the risk, I should pay enough attention to find out why. The fire cracked. She was quiet for a moment. She said, a woman like what? I said, clear-eyed, not easily frightened. The kind who finishes what she starts. She said, you could have described a good dog. I said, I'm not comparing you to a dog. She said, I know. And there was something in her voice that was, I don't have a better word for it than warm, just a warmth that hadn't been there in the first weeks, the careful strategy weeks. It was past that now. I thought you were worth the risk too, she said, for the same reason. I said, what reason? She said, you didn't ask me any questions I didn't want to answer. You didn't push. You just listened and thought and told me to come back tomorrow. That's not nothing. There are men who would have thrown me out for the risk of it and men who would have used it. You just listened. I didn't say anything. She picked the book back up. But after a minute she moved the chair so it was beside mine instead of across from it, and set the book back down on her knee, and that was the rest of the evening. Her reading, me working, the fire going down. That was 11 years ago. The claims paid out well. She hired a mine manager the first year and a second one 2 years later when the silver in the northern vein turned out to be deeper than the survey had found. She knows every decision that gets made out there. Every one. The managers know she'll ride out unannounced and she'll know if the numbers are wrong. My shop is full now. Has been since the second year after the ruling word got around that the curse was Draper's invention, and Draper himself had left the county by then. Some trouble with a cattle lease, so there was no one to maintain the story. I've taken on 2 men to help. I'm 51 and my hands are still good, and I plan to work until they're not. We built onto the back of the house the 3rd year. Her idea, her design, she drew it up herself at the kitchen table, and I looked at it and said it was solid because it was. She has a room that's hers, not her bedroom. A separate room with her desk and her books and the window that looks east toward the Caldera Basin. She goes in there in the mornings after the early coffee. There's a photograph of her father on the desk. I've looked at it sometimes, passing the open door. A careful-looking man with a careful-looking face, not warm exactly, but exact, like a man who measured things twice and was at peace with that. Cora has his eyes, the shape of them, the way they take things in. I think about what she said in the courthouse, that he'd known, that he'd come to Myrna and paid me to make the box because he was being careful about the future the same way he'd been careful about everything, laying things where they belonged so they'd be there when they were needed. I don't know if he would have liked me, the way Cora said on the Trace Road, but I think he would have understood the part I played. I made a box that held what needed holding. I kept a secret that needed keeping. And when the time came, I opened it the way it was built to be opened, and what was inside was still there and still good. There's something about that I find satisfying, the same way I find mechanisms satisfying, things that do what they were made to do. The morning I'm thinking of, the one that sits cleanest in me, was last October. Cold again, the way October gets. I was in the shop early and she came in from the house with 2 cups of coffee, the way she sometimes does when she's past my door and the light is on, and she set one down on the corner of my workbench without saying anything and stood at the window with hers. The window looks north. You can see the beginning of the Caldera Basin on clear days, the buttes going blue in the distance. She said, clear enough to see the second butte. I said, She stood there with her cup and I worked, and after a while she said, without looking at me, the kind of thing she says sometimes that she doesn't make any particular production of. "I'm glad you said yes." I said, "So am I." She came and stood beside me for a minute, her shoulder at mine, looking at the piece I was working on. She knows enough now to see what a thing is supposed to be, what part goes where, what a fitting looks like when it's right. She has opinions, not always ones I agree with, but they're solid opinions and she can back them up. After a while, she went back to her room with her coffee and her book. I kept working. The light came in through the north window, and the fire in the forge got hot, and the metal did what metal does when you know what you're doing with it. Outside, the caldera buttes were going from blue to brown in the morning light, and somewhere out there 12 silver claims were running the way a well-designed mechanism runs, doing what they were built to do. She'd done that, held on to what was hers and come through the dark dry wash in the middle of the night and knocked 3 times low on a cursed blacksmith's door. And when I opened it, she'd asked me to listen. I'm glad I did.